All right. Thanks everyone for joining this webinar. So we are going to talk about a really exciting topic today. And we're going to talk about how to be a more impactful manager, specifically 5 ways to be a more impactful manager. And we have some awesome panelists that will share their insights, and we'll intro them in a second. But this event is sponsored by AllVoices and eqtble. And the topic really hits home if we think about some of the stats around this, and we look at the common phrase that people don't leave companies, they leave bad managers, or non-effective managers. So there's a study that shows that 57% of unhappy employees leave their jobs because of their managers. That's a pretty high number, and that's a reason why we should target and have this conversation today. In a state of employee feedback in 2021, AllVoices found that 41% of people have left their job because they didn't feel listened to, which if you think about who you spend most of your time with, or who has a responsibility to listen to you, it is your manager in that sense. And then 37% have left the job because they felt feedback wasn't taken seriously. Their feedback wasn't taken seriously. And so in both of those situations, this sort of should set the stage and get everyone excited about this topic and the people we have today who are going to walk us through the best ways to be a more impactful manager. And so we're going to intro our folks now. And so Anu, if you could please go first and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So pretty much my entire career has been focused on leadership development and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I am currently the global head of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging at Magic Leap. And I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. And Tom, you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Floyd. I'm the founder of a company called Flourosity. Flourosity is a word that I invented that means the state of flourishing, something I truly want for all of us. And Flourosity is a professional development company. So we do consulting, we develop programs for managers and leaders. We do coaching. I'm an executive coach also, and we do offsites. We're based in Sonoma County, California, for folks who love wine and have been to wine regions. That's where we are, and that's me.
Amazing. Thank you both for the intro. And a quick note about myself and about AllVoices and eqtble, both sponsored the event. So I'm one of the co-founders and chief product officer of eqtble. eqtble, we're working to essentially give you insight into your people data, help you make data-driven decisions around your people. We are challenging the market with startups and SMBs around their thinking in people analytics and enabling the leaders. AllVoices' mission is to create and maintain a healthy culture by helping their customers collect, manage, and resolve employee feedback. So it's a really powerful employee feedback management platform and the easiest way to manage employee feedback. So it's a little bit about the panelists and myself as the moderator and the companies that are sponsoring this event. So we're going to get it kicked off today. There is an opportunity to make this a bit more dynamic with the attendees. We have quite a few here. If you do have any questions or anything, please, while we're talking, please shoot it over. We'll make this more conversational and hopefully get like a lot of really powerful and dynamic lessons from this. Kick it right off the bat. Anu, who was your best manager to date and why?
So it's interesting. I would actually say, so it was someone who was on the same level as my manager. And just we really always, I think, just found a way to really focus on my development and growth, even at times when I wasn't thinking about my development and growth. I was just kind of focused on what was ahead of me. And he always made sure to find ways to really advocate and really ensure that I moved my career forward.
That's awesome. So the being able to advocate and really make sure you're moving forward outside of just that box of your career and your current career, your current job. And Tom, what about you?
This is a tough question. For me, it's like I've been lucky. I've had several great managers in my career. And so it's a 3-way tie. And I can tell you the traits that all 3 did that worked really well for me. One, when I think about all 3 of them, They were pretty fierce and challenging me. And I don't mean that in a scary way. I mean, they were constantly pushing how I was seeing things, how I was thinking about things, how I was approaching things. And I appreciated that. Like I would leave a lot of meetings with them, one-on-ones or team meetings or whatever, thinking about it in a good way, being like, huh, okay, I took like 3 things from that I can do something with. And I absolutely loved that. I think the other thing that they all 3 did is they gave me stretch opportunities, and they gave me so many stretch opportunities. I might have peed my pants a little bit a few times with it. Like they really just showed through their actions that they believed in me. And when they were giving me things, that it might have been things honestly that I'd never done before, they still were like, you got this and you're going to learn from this. And I'm right here if you need me. And I'll join, I'll come in when you need me, but I think you got this. And I think I appreciated that the most.
Yeah. So it's that autonomy that's like really powerful, I think, right? Because they're not just telling you like, this is the way to do it, but they're empowering you to move forward.
Totally.
Right. Anu, any thoughts on sort of that empowerment and like, essentially anytime you had a situation where either you yourself or someone, has done this to you where they've empowered you to take that next step as opposed to like hand holding you or micromanaging?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the sign of a great leader is to really be able to empower you, to stretch you, and to have you think in different ways that you haven't been thinking before. So I think those definitely have been the best leaders that I've had.
Yeah. So some of it we'll do as we go through this webinar a bit. We'll talk about like a little bit of the concrete, like actual lesson, right? So a lesson to take away from that is, right, the empowerment. So if you're a manager working with, a team, don't cradle them, don't hold their hand, maybe let them go, maybe do that trial by fire a bit is what we're learning from here. So now targeting a bit of like the challenges or opportunities as we see managers are facing right now. And this, Tom, I'm going to direct this question to you, but like when we're thinking about what are some of the challenges, maybe you could give us just a couple of like, okay, these are the challenges, and this is what I would how I would approach it as a manager.
I think there's a lot of challenges. I don't mean that in a scary way. I mean that in a very realistic way. Being a manager is hard. I mean, I think it's probably one of the hardest roles in business, regardless of if you work for a big company, a high growth company, a small business. It's consistently difficult. I think my experience has been one of the things that's really challenging for managers, and it starts when someone first becomes a manager, is people can think it's a change in what you do. And it is, but it's more importantly, it's a change in how you think. And really, like if you think about how you deliver results, as an example, as an individual contributor, it's like, these are my results. I get recognized for my results. I love my results. When you become a manager, your personal results don't really matter as much. They're different. It's now you're recognized for your team's results. And if we think about the micromanagement thing and the autonomy thing from a few minutes ago, I think all of us see new managers and some quite experienced managers, if I'm being honest, really struggle with that. I think another challenge for managers is they're asked to do many things, and it's like they're balancing multiple plates in parallel. And so they have to learn how to lead and be really good developers of people. They also have to be amazing at building relationships, particularly cross-functional relationships. They have to invest in those. They want to be playing offense on those, not defense, so to speak. The fact that I just used a sports analogy, somebody who doesn't like sports, just kind of blew my own mind with that. Anyway, I digress. The third thing is they have to make sure that they've set their team up in a way that their team is able to deliver those results and scale, because they want growth. And so they constantly have to be thinking about scale. I think there's another thing that's been particularly acute, and this is not going to be news to anybody on this webinar, but the past several years in particular has been a situation or a state of ongoing crisis. And the crises keep changing. Just when we have gotten through one, there's another one or two or five lurking around the corner. And so I think the nature of what managers have been asked to do continues to evolve. Some of the things that traditionally they may have turned to HR or a people team to address, they're having to address some of those things. They're having to improve their expertise, I think, in a lot of different areas, diversity, inclusion, and equity being one. And if we think about some of the crises, I don't think those are going away. And I don't mean it, I'm a realist. I don't mean that in a scary way. I mean it as just expect them to happen. We know right now we're in a shaky market, as an example, a shaky market and an economy. So if recession comes into the picture, we'll start to see things like layoffs and things like that. And that becomes particularly challenging for managers as well. So it's like it's a web. It's a really complex web that I think a lot of managers find themselves in today.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I hope that attendees look at the recording and grab some of those notes there. And there's one that I want to like hyper focus on, and it's one I think you said in the beginning where so you're recognized for the team results, right? So you're basically moving away from an IC to a manager. You're moving and you're transitioning. There's no longer a premium on your technical skills. Let's say if you're an engineer moving into like an engineering manager role, now there's a premium on your how you develop, as you said, how you develop your people. And so I'm with this question for Anu, when we're talking about this and we're saying, okay, I'm an IC, I'm about 4 years into my career. I got the opportunity to be a manager over, let's say, a team of 3 people. What am I doing as a first-time manager? Like, what are some of the concrete like takeaways and steps and actions that I should be taking?
And I think the first thing, and the light keeps turning on and off, so I apologize. So one of the first things I think is, with all the leaders I've worked with over the years, there are a minimum of 3 balls that everybody's juggling. So one is going to be business goals and outcomes. Second one is going to be really building the team around me, so their growth, their development. And then there's my own growth and development. And there's many more than these 3 balls that we're juggling that are in play, but the first one that typically falls is the one that focuses on ourselves. So that has to be a priority. We're so focused on team, we're focused on the outcomes and goals. So really making sure that managers are taking time to focus on their growth and their development. So that would be the first thing, to always make sure that we're doing that. Second thing is, how do we co-create this culture together? And so sometimes you hear people talk about culture carriers, and the way that I think about that is someone over here is setting the culture and then the rest of us are carrying it. And instead of that, it's more about how do we all co-create this culture together at the team level, at the organizational level, and all of our actions, we have shared responsibility. And so what I do matters. And so I think even, making sure that the manager isn't coming in thinking that this is all on my shoulders, it's actually all of us doing this together. So those would be 2 pieces, but I can, I think like Tom, I think we can both come up with many, but those would be 2 that typically managers aren't focusing as much on, that I would definitely recommend that they do.
Yeah, that point about focusing on yourselves, I feel like that hits home. I think often like you're trying to juggle doing a lot for the company, doing a lot and doing right by your team. And then you sort of like lose that focus of like, how do I become a better manager? You sort of just get into like and fall back into the motion. So really, really hits home. But I think one of the things that I do want to focus on is like this idea of culture. I think it's a pretty esoteric thought sometimes when people talk about culture. I know people get rejected. As an analytics guy, I think people often get rejected from roles for culture, right? They say you're not a culture fit. But what does that actually mean? But I think in terms that like you're really, culture to me is like building trust, right? It's building trust with your team and identifying opportunities to build trust with your team and learn from them. So we're all scattered around the world. We're everywhere, right? We all have remote teams these days, even those that are in person, we have remote teams. So Anu, like, how are you approaching this? And how are you thinking about effective ways to build trust so that we can co-create this culture together?
Yeah. So 2 things come to mind. One is we look at one of the top reasons that people leave organizations, and it's because they don't feel cared for enough or cared about enough. They don't feel appreciated, valued, respected. So a big part of this is really creating a culture of inclusion, of belonging, so that we matter. And so the more that, that we are creating that, then obviously people are going to have a different experience. I'm more committed again. And then I see myself as that culture co-creator. So a specific example, and one that I love to do, it requires a little bit of vulnerability, that when we bring teams together, any type of sharing, so of personal stories. It's enhancing that trust. It's fostering that connection. And then we're actually able to navigate some of those more challenging situations when there's conflict that comes up. You're more likely to approach it with compassion, understanding, curiosity versus judgment. And so one of the things that I love to do is I actually ask people, what are the top 3 values that matter most to you? And then we do a little bit of sharing around, what are some stories then where, that you can actually share a little bit about why those values are so important. And it's a quick exercise, but every single time we've done it, what happens is that people start to focus on commonalities. We appreciate differences, but we start to connect with each other. And then when the tough stuff happens, we're able to actually navigate that, better. And this is just continuing to have these connection activities is going to actually, no matter how dispersed we are geographically, we're able to connect as one team, as a cohesive unit.
Yeah, I really like that example of like an actual, people can ask for these top 3 values. And I think what it does is it's moving away from just the fact that like I have an output, like I have here's my job in the company, but here I am as a person. And this is what matters to me. I'll give a shout out to one of my co-founders who asks everyone every Monday, Joseph, and how's your weekend, right? And starts it out, and we don't talk shop. We just talk about how was your weekend, what'd you do, no pressure, no shop talk, basically. So it really gets beyond just the fact that like we're all here to just build, but like we all are also here as people. And so talking about that a bit, it's a hot topic of one-on-ones, right? So for thinking about one-on-ones for career development, it's how do we move past the thing where I'm just like talking to you for a transactional purpose? I want you to do X, Y, Z, and then you're not performing. But now I'm thinking about you as a person, as a human being. I want to make sure you're successful in your career. So Tom, what are your thoughts on like how to develop a one-on-one so it is effective at incorporating career development into that?
So many thoughts and so many things anew that you just shared resonate too. I think if I make a quick bridge backwards from one-on-ones to trust, even to culture, I think starting out with one-on-ones, a manager's goal with the first several and then ongoing is to build and maintain trust. Like that is the most important thing. If it's not there, those one-on-ones just are not going to go well. And if I think back to culture, if it is intangible, and I think one aspect of it, of many, are values, right? And for many people, I think when they see values, they're like, oh, those are those words on the wall that I look at every once in a while, or they're in the employee handbook or whatever. But if a value is around trusting others, building trust, or being vulnerable, as an example, suddenly there's things like that in the culture that are signs that tell us, oh, we're all expected to do this. We should do this. That's how we roll here. And so when I think about managers in their one-on-ones, they have to be willing to be vulnerable to build trust. They have to be willing to talk about themselves, what's on their minds, things that are challenging for them. They have to model for their direct reports, hey, it's okay to be open. I'll be open with you if you're open with me. And for direct reports, that's important because they're not sure, particularly if it's a new manager. They're like, how much can I really share here versus not share? And so if right off from the very beginning, if managers are doing that and focused on getting to know people just in general, it's going to come much more naturally and be easier to have career development conversations then, because to talk about our careers, we have to be willing to be vulnerable, because some of us know, like, we're like, yep, it's been clear to me since I was 4 years old. I want to do this and then this and then this. For other people, they're like, well, I used to think I knew, but now I don't, I'm not sure, or there was just a big change. I don't know what that means for me. And so managers have to create a space for people to feel comfortable bringing it up. And they also have to create a space where they proactively ask, where it's not kind of this check the box, it's your mid-cycle check-in type of thing. How are you feeling about your career? And there's the kind of scripted robotic list of questions. Like, that they ask, and it isn't that. They have to really be willing to proactively have that space, and then naturally and organically start coaching their direct reports and really start exploring it. More to say there. That was already a lot. I'll pause there, and happy to double click on any of those.
Yeah, so something we can maybe spend a little bit more time about, that vulnerability aspect, right? So, I'm a co-founder of a company, right? So there's no one, right, above, maybe investors, but there's no one above. And so the question at that point is like, how do you introduce that vulnerability so your team trusts you? With, obviously there's this fear of not being like, who else will know if you don't know, right? So if you get asked a technical question and you get asked to develop XYZ, and like, how do I do XYZ? And you say, I just don't know. There's no one else that will know. And so, plenty of thoughts on that, but I want to, shoot that back to you, Tom, and just see, what would be your approach in that situation?
I think you're going to lead by example. So like, if we use the example that you just used, if I say as the founder or as a senior leader, I don't know, I just made it okay for you to say, I don't know, and for us to have a conversation about it. If you don't say that, I might wear a mask or put a wall up or believe that I'll look bad if I don't know, and nobody wants to look bad. And so for some of us, we would really care about like, no, gosh, I always want to have the answers. I'm valued for, air quotes, the answers on things. So if you role model that, I can do it. And if you also start talking about what's difficult for you, which is hard for any of us, it makes it easier for me to be vulnerable and talk about what's difficult for me. So if as a leader, you tell me something that you're working on personally, if you say something like, hey, I know that I avoid conflict sometimes at work, me and conflict aren't BFF. I'm working on that. I'm noticing sometimes I shy away from hard conversations. Then suddenly, not only have you helped me with you, and I'm like, oh, I might need to change my approach with X person, knowing that conflict might not feel great for them, but also we've just suddenly created a conversation about how we deal with conflict at work, which conflict is not bad. It's actually neutral. It's how we handle it. I should say natural instead of neutral. It's natural. It's how we handle it that really changes things. But we have to be willing to talk about ourselves and what we're learning about ourselves, where we're growing, where we're struggling. I think that's where starting to open up that vulnerability envelope, so to speak, happens at work.
Yeah. And talking more about this vulnerability aspect, and we're going to borrow your DEIB experience here, but I'm curious, we're all hyper focused on this, and we all want to know, how to be better allies, how to be more supportive in this world. And I think the question for you is, what are some takeaways if you're a manager of, a minority group, and how can we best be those allies to support in the career development and lift up that vulnerability and enable that?
Yeah. I loved everything that both of you have shared so far. When I think about vulnerability, it's human to human connection. And if I'm sharing something that maybe, I'm not doing well, or something that's an area of development for me, that's actually letting people know that nobody here has to be perfect. We're all in this together. And development, it's interesting. In so many organizations have actually shared that, our CEO has developmental areas, and people are like, whoa, did you just say that out loud? And I said, of course, we all have developmental opportunities, right? We all have strengths as well. And so how do we leverage that? And what are we focusing on that we develop? So with respect to DEIB and really being better allies, I think the first and foremost is you're looking at an individual level and at a team level. So how are we co-creating that culture again, so people feel included? They feel like their voice matters. They feel like they truly belong. They can bring their full selves to work and be that, and not have to wear, this mask, or time to like build a wall and kind of step back. So it's really about looking at our actions and our decision making, and is that actually moving towards exclusion or inclusion? And just taking that reflection time, I think, makes a big difference. And it's interesting. I actually encourage managers all the time to have conversations, not how's it going? How do you feel on the team? But even be specific of what ways do you feel excluded on the team? So be very direct. what ways do you feel included on the team? And letting people know back to that care, I'm invested in really creating a very inclusive culture on our team. So here is what I'm doing. What else can I do? And so I think it's being very direct is what's going to make that difference versus the general, how do you feel? How's it going? People aren't going to open up and share. But if you ask those pointed questions, you're going to get a lot of different answers.
Yeah, it's like the casual, like, what's up? You know, like if you just say to someone, hey, what's up? Like you don't expect a response, but, or hey, how you doing? Like, but if you actually ask like a real question about them, you'll get a response. But it goes back to like what I feel like we're getting at is asking for feedback, right? You're as a manager, and it's that vulnerability, right? So it's being comfortable saying, I don't know everything, but then it's also asking for feedback. And so, you know, what are some ways that you can sort of like naturally with your team, you know, ask for feedback, get that continuous feedback from yourself so that you can then improve as a manager? And you hit on some of the points, but maybe we can flush it out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about normalizing feedback again. So it's not something where, Gabe, you're going to give me some developmental constructive feedback. I'm going to get a little nervous. You take me to the exact same room every single time, or you only give that feedback on Fridays. So it's about normalizing the conversation, normalizing feedback, and it's engaging the other person. It's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. And so how do we have that conversation where I might be, asking Tom, how do you feel that you're doing, as far as your strengths, what's going really well? And then I give feedback. And then I say, I ask, what are some areas that you may want to focus on? Then I give feedback. And it's also asking for feedback for myself. And so if I may not get that, you're actually setting that up ahead of time. So it said, okay, great. Well, you know what? Next time we're going to be meeting in X number of weeks. I'd love for you to reflect on that and then share whatever feedback that you have for me. So we're normalizing it. We're setting that expectation, and it's a comfortable conversation because it is in service of, I care about you. I'm invested in your success. That's why I want to give you that feedback. And that little one-liner of I'm invested in you, I'm invested in your success, that's the difference maker. Because what's the purpose of feedback? It's not just for me to tell you it's not going well. It's because I care about you and I want to help you succeed. So I think just having that framework is going to make this it's easier, and it diffuses tension for some people who, I think some people, there's a difference of taking feedback in and taking feedback on. What is feedback? It's data. In a specific period of time of how you're being perceived. It is not about who you are as a person. And so making that clarification and sharing that why I'm invested in, how I'm invested in your success is going to just change that feedback conversation significantly.
Yeah, and I think, focusing on this idea of being invested in your success, caring about you, it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. There's a lot of really good, nuggets here and really good sayings. But there's a question from the audience that I think, this can help, or this sort of maybe contrasts a bit. So let's say, this person is a current manager. How do they get better at workplace conflict? Right. So in the event that you say, obviously you care about this person, you're creating this vulnerability, but there's still a conflict. Like, what are the steps and practices that we can do to either create a space that conflict can even happen, right? Because they might not even feel comfortable to create a conflict. And then B, how to resolve it. And I'll move that over to Tom if you have any thoughts here.
Oh, do I have thoughts? I don't smoke, but this is one of those topics where I need a virtual cigarette, and, I think there's several things with that. I think one thing is with conflict at work, it starts with our personal relationship with conflict. I am a fan of a tool called the TKI, the Thomas Kilmann instrument, as an example. And what it teaches, what I love, it's not a personality assessment. It shows you, hey, there's 5 different ways you can deal with conflict. And at this moment in time, it's like it takes a snapshot of you. You're grabbing this tool in your toolbox, this one of the 5 more than you're grabbing the other 4, or you're grabbing these 2 more than the other 3. And so once you know that, you kind of start to realize, okay, there's actually different ways that I can respond to conflict based on the situation. in front of me, but I have to know first what my go-to is and realize that my go-to might not always work. For me, for example, my go-to is collaboration. Collaboration is a form of dealing with conflict, and that I'll really want to get 100% of your needs met and 100% of my needs met. Sometimes that's amazing. Sometimes it's not, though. It takes a long time to get both parties, both teams, both individuals' needs met. So it's not always going to serve me, right? So there's that. I think the second thing is, you, as a manager, you've got to be willing to name it when there's conflict. Sometimes I see managers trying to be very polished about this, or kind of, let's take that offline. You know, you'll hear a comment like that in a meeting, or you'll feel it festering. And if you talk to the manager one-on-one, what the coach part of me would tell you is that managers always know. They know. They're like, oh, something weird's going on in the team right now, or ooh, that did not feel good, or I am not my best self this week, and here's why. Like, we will all say that, right? But kind of back to vulnerability. If we don't talk about it, if we don't just say, hey, how's everybody feeling right now? I noticed something just changed in the room. You know, Gabe, I heard you say this. I noticed when Gabe said that, you crossed your arms, you kind of look a little bit disengaged right now. What's up? Let's talk about that. Like, they really have to be willing to name it. I think another thing, I'll say two more things. I think another thing is, if we link back to feedback, I've always found it interesting that for many people, feedback is conflict to them. So I might worry as a manager, if I ask you for feedback, it'll lead to conflict. Or I might worry if I give you feedback as my manager, that might be conflict. And they're kind of like a Venn diagram. They can relate to each other. But the feedback, essentially, it helps. Again, it's conflict itself is natural. It's a tension. Feedback helps us all grow and get better at what we're doing. The last thing I would say is, if I channel our friend Patrick Lencioni and we think about the 5 dysfunctions of a team, fantastic book that really has been around for a while now. There's this pyramid in it, right? It's a triangle, and at the bottom of the pyramid is trust. That to get to the other layers of the pyramid, you've got to have trust. And the next layer is conflict. And so what Lencioni essentially teaches, that I've always been a fan of, is that if you have trust, the chances of you engaging in conflict, which when done well is a healthy debate, is going to be higher, because you're going to feel like, okay, we're in that space where we can debate ideas back and forth, debate pros and cons back and forth. If that trust isn't there, though, we're not going to do that, because we're really going to be concerned about how that's going to come across. I guess the fifth thing, see, I knew this would be a big one for me. There is an art to having hard conversations. When you need to have a hard conversation, I think there is an art form to that. I think one of the best books on that is Crucial Conversations, and the great work that Vital Smarts does, that really helps you get clear on what the facts are, what the story is that you're telling yourself based on those facts, and ultimately kind of what the impact that that's having on you or others. There is definitely a skill there that is probably a panel discussion in and of itself, but those are some of my initial thoughts on it. It's a big topic.
Yeah, and I want to, I have a personal anecdote to share here around like that trust and conflict being so close together. But so I mean, co-founders, right, as you know, like have to have the highest level of trust in one another, but also probably have the most heated conversations and conflict. And so often have those arguments, but and pretty heated. But when you realize that, I think one of the things I always go back to is that you argue the idea, not the person, right? So you argue and you challenge the idea and the concept, and as long as people can step back from it. Obviously, we're all super emotional about it. We love our ideas the way we love sports teams, the way we love food, the way we love all these things, the way we love our family. But the idea, if we could step back and actually understand the other person's position, how they're analyzing it, can really help. And that's something that I've definitely experienced. So appreciate those thoughts. And I think there was a lot of also books that were mentioned there that are super helpful, and maybe we can send those out after to all the the list of that to all the attendees after. But continuing on this theme of like, we're going to do a little bit of a fun exercise here, and we're going to start we're going to start with Anu on this. We're going to give a piece of feedback that I hope that was given, that, what this example, was, and we're going to try to fix it. So how the prompt is, how would you fix this feedback to be more actionable and effective? We're all right. It's going to be a little fun exercise. I'm going to read the feedback out loud. All right. I am the manager speaking to the employee. I've gotten a lot of feedback from your team that you were showing up as sorry, this is actually in reverse. I've gotten a lot of feedback from your team that you're showing up as a micromanager. So either you think of it from a manager to an employee who's a manager, or upwards feedback. Several of them have said that you talked about it, but they also said you're a bad listener. I know you are OCD about things being completed on time, but if this behavior doesn't change, I'm not sure you're going to be successful in this role.
Let's not do that.
Great.
So many things to that.
There's hopefully a lot to fix there. But what are some of the things, what are some of the red flags to you and things that you would immediately change? Obviously, we want to change the whole way of constructing it, but what are some immediate red flags to you?
I think it's interesting. What I found successful has always been what I shared earlier is stating my why for giving that feedback. Because if you're going in there and you're sharing feedback, it's people, while you know what your why is, that you're sharing this information to develop someone, it's not always easy to take from someone else if they don't understand your intent, regardless of how many types of conversations you have. So I always start with the why, and the why is actually not that I want to give you feedback to change a behavior. The why is because I'm invested in your career. I'm invested in developing you. I care about you. That's how I've always started, and saying it in the most authentic way, not a script. And just really sharing, here are some things that I've been hearing. Would love to get your thoughts. I turn it into a conversation. Sometimes we do have to be more directive, but I actually want to engage in a conversation to see how this person is actually perceiving what specific situations have been happening, and then going deeper into that. And this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, of a lot of people either give feedback very directly that is not building the relationship. That's one, or people actually avoid giving direct feedback at all, right? You're doing great. If there's a problem, I'll let you know. So I would say two things that I want to emphasize here is starting with the why, and actually engaging in a conversation of, here's what's come up. I'd love to discuss with you. What are your thoughts? And then actually moving, to talking about what's the impact of this behavior, whether it is perceived or the actual impact, because some people are focused very much on intention. And it's not necessarily the intention, it is the impact of your behavior. It's the impact of your words as well. And then I would actually follow up with then where do we go from here? So what are some things that you want to focus on with your team so you can be perceived in the way that you want? You can create the culture that you want. It's a lot of different pieces to break down.
Right. But the focus on like what's next is really powerful, because it gives them a blueprint to improve. It doesn't end it at like you are bad at your job and therefore there is no other path except for being fired. So you're sort of saying like, okay, yes, we're not doing well here, but what can we do to improve, because the show's not over. So Tom, that snippet, that feedback, what would you change that Anu hasn't already mentioned or shared?
Anu already nailed it, and that was some bad feedback, right? And what is particularly cringeworthy about it is we've all gotten feedback like that, and we can always improve how we give feedback, but we can't fix the bad feedback givers. And so we're going to hear things like that sometime. I think a couple things jump out just to be clear about what I think is wrong with that feedback. One, we all know when it comes to feedback, there's a certain kind of sandwich we've all been taught about that has two buns and meat in the middle, and both buns taste great and the meat doesn't. I think we hear that in that feedback, like, are you recognizing me right now for what I'm doing well? Because you said something kind of good, and then there's clearly some bad stuff in it, but then you kind of tell me that I'm okay also. One. Two, we hear labels in it. And I think a lot of time, and labels are a big category because immediately can leap into other areas like DEI, as an example. So labels, period, aren't helpful. If you tell me I'm a blueberry, I love blueberries, but do I want to be a blueberry? Like, what does that mean to just say I'm a blueberry? Like, what? I can't do anything with that beyond eat blueberries. If you tell me I'm aggressive, as an example, which for some communities, that label comes out frequently and is rooted in stereotypes, not only are you not giving me helpful feedback, but you also just triggered me because you now tapped into my lived experience, what I hear, and that doesn't feel great. And so there's a couple labels in that feedback. One, we heard micromanager. You're a micromanager. Well, what do I do with that? So if we're building on what Anu is saying and like getting at the behavior, it's like, for example, you're frequently prescriptive in the instructions you give your team, and you tend to ask a lot of questions about their work. The impact is team members aren't sure about how much autonomy that they have, or aren't sure if they can make their own decisions. So you can take micromanager or listener, bad listener, I think is another one in that, is that what I have found that means when people are using labels, if you just try to zoom out, is they haven't spent enough time really thinking about what those behaviors are. Like, what are you trying to say? What could we see? What could we hear? What could we both talk about? That's really the art there. And it's hard. I think this is why giving feedback is probably one of the toughest skills that's out there. The last thing about that feedback, I think we got to talk about OCD. Is that when we hear that term, it's also, again, back to DEI. What are we trying to say there? So if you're telling me I'm OCD, one, why is that bad? Two, what if I have obsessive compulsive disorder? Are you shaming me for that? Is there something wrong with that? So it's problematic. It's really problematic. Because it really taps into some unhealthy beliefs in that case. So, I mean, that last piece, I mean, y'all already kind of said that. Then ending your feedback with a threat, I'm not sure that's going to get the result for anybody, that you're looking for. And upon self-reflection later, the feedback giver is probably going to feel like crap, and definitely the person who got that feedback is going to feel like crap too.
Right. I found that hitting on these points, obviously, being extremely showing empathy. I think that's the theme, right? Showing empathy in this process, but really goes a long way, right? And goes back to like our conversations about trust and vulnerability, right? If you show empathy to these people, to your team, you get a result that actually benefits you, right? So if your goal
Totally.
is to, right, we all know that the onboarding time, right, from an analytics perspective, the onboarding time for someone is typically 3 to 5 months. There's different studies that say 2 months or whatever, but the average is 3 to 5 months, let's say. So are you pushing this person out the door because they're a low performer, or because you can't manage them? And if you can't manage them, and now you're being potentially detrimental to your team as a whole, because your team's gonna have a low performance because you have high churn, and then obviously you as a manager will suffer as well. So think about it from that perspective of like, well, how can I actually improve this person's situation and then improve my own, right, as a result, if you want to think about it that way, or improve the holistic team. So we have another piece of feedback, and this is a lot shorter to dissect, but I think has a lot in it. I need you to speak up more during meetings. That's the feedback. I need you to speak up more during meetings. Back to Anu. What are we fixing?
So what's interesting is bringing in the DEI component here, right? So what's the behavior we're looking for? And I actually want to say, what are we actually paying attention to? So I'll share an interesting story. I had a coaching client a few years ago where she was a higher level leader, and her leader had recommended that in her coaching engagement that she actually focus on sharing more of her thought leadership and speaking up. And what was interesting when we dug a little bit deeper was that she did speak up. Sometimes she just takes a little bit of time to process things. And so she would follow up in an email, share in the next meeting, or take a little bit of time and share in that same meeting. So whenever I hear that, I do actually cringe a little bit because I've encountered this as a coaching theme many, many times. And so sometimes bias does play a big role in that type of feedback. So it was interesting because what we did in that coaching engagement is we actually worked on ensuring that her leader was paying attention to that behavior of when she was actually speaking up. So it was more of that, how does that bias creep in, and what can we do to really shift her leader's attention to that behavior because she was speaking up. So that is always something interesting that, what is your image, the bias here? What is your image of a leader? What do they think? How do they act? How do they speak? And so is that something that basically mirrors you, or are you actually looking authentically at somebody? And seeing how they show up. So I'm going to challenge that piece of feedback from that DEI lens, first of all. And then second, it's always, you want to give very concrete, specific feedback of when it was happening, what did it look like, what was the impact of it, and then what can you do differently? But again, here, some people are going to be a little bit, maybe there might be an introvert, right? Maybe there's a gender bias here. There's so many things that we can pick apart here. So I would just ask that if it were someone else, would you give the same behavior? Why or why not? So before we give that feedback, look at what biases might be coming into play.
Yeah, and I really like the fact that, like, again, we're thinking about the person, and we're saying, like, well, what are the factors that led to this person not speaking up to me? Also, giving a concrete example goes a really long way, because they can actually look back and say, well, this is what I was thinking at this moment, and they can have a conversation about it, as opposed to being like general, right? They always say, like, in your family relationships, which obviously a lot of comparisons get drawn to the workplace, but in your family relationship, you don't say, you always do this, right? Like, you always don't empty the dishwasher, right? Because is that true? Do they always do? Or is it sometimes? And like, what happened in that moment? Maybe they were distracted. Maybe there was something going on. And how can we fix and learn from that moment? So
there's going to be a lot of fights there, Gabe. If it's you always do this.
Exactly. You want those definitive statements. So in the always, and obviously looking at the, again, we talked about this in the ones that I'm not sure you're going to be successful in this role, is a definitive statement, and saying, like, sort of writing the script there. So I do want to open it up to questions, but prior to opening up to questions to everyone, we have a final question for both Tom and Anu. We'll start with Tom, but what is your call to action to be a great manager?
Oh gosh, that's a hard one. I think my call to action for managers, one, is be kind. And it starts with being kind to yourself. I think if we can get more managers recognizing and getting comfortable with the fact that it's a hard role, you're never going to have all the answers. You are always going to be facing something new. And I'll come back to one of the verbs that Anu used earlier that I loved. You've got to co-create it with the rest of your team. You're not alone. Be kind to yourself. Connect with your team. Connect with your peers. Connect with your boss. Connect with your customer. Connect with your cross-functional partners. You will learn everything that you need through all of them. If you are focused on them and you are being your vulnerable, authentic self, you've already made your job 1,000 times easier.
It's great. Love that call to action. Anu, what are your thoughts?
I will say, authentically show people how you care. So do it in a way where they feel it. And so we've talked about empathy in this call for a bit. So it's perspective taking and really being able to show in that unique way. Caring might look in one way for you, Tom. It might look a different way for you, Gabe. So really showing up in that authentic way and personalizing it. And when people know that you care, everything else, it's so much easier.
It's amazing when you actually, right, you show care in another person, how they respond, right? And they say, okay, you're not just in it, for one reason, for what to extract from me. But yeah, these are really powerful. The one thing I would add, if I have an opportunity to share my call to action, is the curiosity. Right. So like never, right, as an IC, I think often you're working to learn, that new technology. I'm a technologist, right? I want to keep learning and keep growing. But then suddenly I become a manager and I'm like, okay, I know how to do this. like I know how they're feeling. I was in their position, but I think if you go from perspective of the empathy that both of you are mentioning and the kindness, and then also the curiosity, it's almost that perfect triangle of like that experience, and just continuously wanting to learn and be humble, right? So if you're curious, you're humble. Because you're curious, you're like, I don't understand that. Tell me. And often you end up then having an opportunity to hire people who are more skilled than you, and you can learn from. So we do have some questions from the audience, and I would like to pose this first question. So what reflection and self-awareness questions do you need to ask yourself if you actually want to be a people manager? So again, what reflection and self-awareness questions do you need to ask yourself if you want to grow into that people manager role? And we'll start with a new. What questions are you asking yourself as your role?
It's interesting because I think if you're looking at it as my end goal is just business goals and outcomes, you're not a people manager. You're a goal achiever. So I would say to really be able to ask yourself, do I want to focus on developing and growing people, and what does that look like? Because I mean, let's face it, if it's technical expertise, I can learn it. The people aspect of it, that is by far the most challenging aspect of being a leader. And so, is this something that I really get excited about? And I want to find innovative ways to really individualize that development and that growth. And if so, fantastic. And there's no right or wrong, because some people may choose to stay as an individual contributor, and that, because I'm more process oriented, I want to focus more on goals and not necessarily people development aspect of it.
Yeah, I like that. And then Tom, what are your thoughts? What questions are you asking? What's swirling through your head as you're saying, okay, this is the best way to be a people manager?
What do I love about my current role? What do I imagine managing people here is? What will I enjoy the most about that role? What will I not enjoy about that role? How much patience do I have for tough people issues that come up? How comfortable am I with ambiguity? How comfortable am I being vulnerable? I think another one, a lot of times that it's, look, it's a legit concern, and it just depends on the company, depends on the culture, is what are the reasons why I want to become a manager? I think what we see a lot, it's like a tale as old as the hills, so to speak. If we're checking that box, like, oh, I really want to grow in this company, it looks like manager is the only way to grow. Well, that might be true, unfortunately, for that specific company, but if you enjoy it, still matters. You've got to love all those things that Anu just said, because if you don't, you're just not going to be happy in that role, and you won't be happy being a manager anywhere. And there's no shame in that, right? Like when I look for folks, when we look at folks in our world, in the learning and development world, when you become a manager, it means you are doing less developing and growing a large number of people. You're developing and growing your team, but you're no longer facilitating those sessions with a large group or doing those coaching engagements or doing things like that. So you can imagine that's hard for people who are truly in their heart motivated by growing people and doing others. In that case, you have to both love growing people and growing a business in that case. So I think we all have to really ask ourselves, like, okay, am I okay giving up some of the things that I love to do different things that I love in this case?
Yeah, that transformation is heavy, right? If you change
Totally.
into like, being solely responsible for yourself, and then moving into like caring, you have to care for people if to be a manager. And if you're not, I appreciate the companies that have like the tracks in the individual contributor world where you can continue to move up in the company in that realm. I don't think it's as popular as it should be, because I think often you get people who are ICs moving into manager roles just as a default, like you said, to climb up the career ladder. We do have another question from the audience, from Betty, and we want to understand, so how do you provide feedback to your CEO in a constructive way? This is a good one. Your CEO in a constructive way. So Anu, what are your thoughts?
Same, regardless of the position or the person, I would start the exact same way. I want to provide you feedback because, and talk about how this feedback is actually going to be impactful. So maybe it's something that the CEO needs to know about the organization, something happening within the organization, or maybe it's actually the CEO's behavior too. But really it's going in and saying, I'm bringing this up because it's really important because ... and then actually providing that feedback. It's when you have the best interest and you're communicating that best interest, that's always what shifts how people perceive and receive that feedback. So I'll even share many years ago, I had to give a VP some feedback, and it was just a really challenging situation. We'd be in meetings and everybody would agree to certain things, and at the very end we would walk away, and then it felt like we were in totally two different meetings, and it kept turning into a problem. So I finally said, you know what, let's actually chat, and I'd love to learn how do we both connect and work together to have the most effective working relationship. So that's the why. And when I shared it that way, I was able to give that person feedback, and that person was able to give me feedback of what they're looking forward to. So again, dialogue and then talking about that why.
Yeah, it's that working together that keeps coming up, that co-creating, which we're gonna definitely have to lock in that phrase. So appreciate you sharing that. And then Tom, you're talking to the CEO. What do you say?
I would add a couple things. So, okay, I have a guilty pleasure, and I only do this guilty pleasure when I'm traveling. When I'm traveling, I might like to pick up Us Weekly, because as the plane's taken off, I just want to have something mindless to read. And there's this section in Us Weekly, and it says celebrities, they're just like us. And you see, Jennifer Aniston picking out carrots in Whole Foods or something. And I think that's what we have to remember with CEOs. CEOs, they're just like us. They need feedback. They're going to respond the same way that we would. We have to be particularly mindful with them as the higher we rise in an organization, the less feedback we get, because people are going to be even more hesitant. That doesn't change our desire for it. I think another thing that comes up for me is if you get an opportunity before you have feedback, particularly if it's a small company, you're going to have this opportunity, ask them how they like to get feedback. They might be like, shoot me an email, or, just be super direct, just tell me, because it's so much easier when you have feedback for them. I think the other thing that I would add that hasn't already been said is keep it casual. I think a lot of times, and actually avoid the F word, not that one, avoid feedback, like avoid saying the word feedback too, just super casually, and to Anu's point, make your intent clear, make it super clear what the behavior is that you're seeing, whether it's their behavior or behavior in the company, and make that impact really clear, but casual. Don't make it feel, I've got feedback, and it's very formal, or you've copied the world on the message, like things like that. Like, I'll come back to Us Weekly, CEOs, they're just like us.
Love that. Yeah. And, appreciate everyone's perspective, and Tom and Anu and everything you've been sharing. I think there's a lot of takeaways for everyone. But so 5, we're just going to talk about 5 that we distilled down, and we're going to talk about those really quickly because I know we're almost at time. But be curious, ask curious questions, curiosity-based questions, actively listen and follow up. That's number 1. We'll send these out after too. But number 2, ask for and be open to feedback of all kinds from all avenues. We talked about feedback a lot. And then deliver that concrete feedback. That's really important, with actionable steps. There's continuous feedback as well. We talked about this quite a few. Invest in your professional development, their professional development as well. So it's a collective, it's co-creating. Work with other managers in your company. So ask for help, right? Learn and learn together. And then finally, show up for your team and show empathy. I think that's the thing that we've talked about the most. Empathy, the trust. Just wildly powerful when you start with that as a manager. Start with that. Even if you are lacking the technical skills and you start with the empathy, your team will appreciate you so much more and learn from you so much more and respect you, and you'll get way better outcomes. So that's it. And I think we have a slide to show. Yes, here's the activity ID. So thank you everyone for coming today and listening to us. And thank you specifically to Anu and Tom for sharing your amazing insights. And really just appreciate everyone. And thanks to AllVoices and Equitable for sponsoring.